Greetings and salutations, Internet. We are gathered here today to bear witness, which is a
Oh,
which is a reference I don't understand yet. But anyway, um, we're here to bear witness to the intellectual and narratological prowess of a large fire-breathing lizard who thinks critically. The internet's resident Grand Maester of Malazan, Dr. A.P. Canavan from A Critical Dragon. How are you today, AP?
A, terribly embarrassed by that introduction. But B, it's great to be here. It's great to be speaking to you in person. Thank you for inviting me. I have no idea how useful anything that I will say will be, but hopefully we'll have a fun conversation.
Look, we might drop some dimes tonight because that intro was completely off the cuff. Um, anyway, I think people on the internet or on this corner of YouTube generally know who you are. And I think if they're going to watch this video, which is about Malazan, since I started Malazan 2 months ago, will probably know who you are. But in case they don't, do you want to give a brief introduction about who you are?
I used to describe myself as a recovering academic, and unfortunately, much like the mafia, they have pulled me back in. I'm back to
Hold you
being an
back.
academic again. I
Fantastic.
thought I had escaped the clutches of academia, but here we are. But yeah, I have a small channel, A Critical Dragon. I talk about science fiction, fantasy, and other forms of narrative in film, television, and in books. But I'm interested in storytelling. I'm interested in how audiences, viewers, readers perceive stories and the different techniques that storytellers use in the different media. And it is such a wonderful, varied, strange, and rich field that you can talk forever about all of these things. And anytime you come up with a general rule or a general statement, someone is going to say, "Oh yeah, but what about you?" Oh yeah, those sneaky authors, those sneaky writers are always looking for ways to break the rules and come up with something entirely different
Yeah,
that you then go, right, well, that no longer works.
yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of rule breakers, we're going to predominantly talk about Stephen Erickson. Well, I presume we'll see where the conversation takes us. I did write some notes for this. I don't usually write notes for things, but there are a couple of things that I want to ask you about and maybe get you to splurge away on if you want to. But firstly, I kind of wanted to ask because I've been watching your channel for a while, but for anybody on subscribe to StoryTube, if you have never seen AP before, how did you get into narratology? Is that what it's called?
Right. And this is it. If people sometimes call me a narratologist, I'm not a narratologist. A
Okay.
narratologist is someone who actually develops the theories and all of that stuff.
Right.
I steal all of the theories and put them into practice because I'm an analyst.
Okay.
But the major literary sort of tradition of analysis that I greatly enjoy is, yeah, a form of structuralism called narratology, which, like a lot of structuralism, is looking at the framework and the rules of how stories are told. And narratology is very specifically looking at different techniques that authors use. And one of the things I love to do is pair it with a completely different approach to literary analysis, which is close reading,
Yeah.
where you actually do that heavy textual analysis. So structuralism does away with all of the detail, and you're looking for these patterns and you're looking for the underlying techniques.
Hmm.
And then you do close reading stuff, which is looking very much at the specificity of word choice and word patterning that
Yeah.
goes on the page. And I think using those two quite diametrically opposed approaches, you get this wonderful sense of what is actually happening on the page, how
Hmm.
an author has taken these random symbols, these words, and created meaning and story and emotion in their reader.
Yeah.
Because the author transmits information through this code, and we as reader decode it. Like we create the meaning from it. And when you think about even just the concept of this, You're looking at random little black splotches on a white page, and in your head, you're going, "That was really cool when he killed that dragon." And you've imagined it or you've felt it. You've been made to cry because of
Hmm.
something happening to an entirely fictitious plot function.
Hmm.
Um, and it's caused you to cry and feel loss and feel grief. You've celebrated the victories of these plot functions and
Yes.
ciphers on a page. And you've felt that emotion. And that is an incredible form of magic. And I'm
Yes, it is.
fascinated by it.
Cool. And how did you come to Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen?
Um, well, I when I was doing my MA at the University of Liverpool, I was interested in going on to do a PhD in fantasy, particularly a lot of epic fantasy, and the impact of gaming, uh, role-playing games, and computer games, how they codified rules, how they approach things, the greater emphasis on magic as an external repeatable feat, role and function influencing the physicality of the characters, all of these sorts of things. A lot of it coming from early RPGs, and then how other RPGs and other computer games popularized them as a form, um, and that influenced how the genre worked
Mm.
because Tolkien. A lot of people look at fantasy and they go, "Oh, it's all from Tolkien." Oh, Tolkien invented elves, and you go tell Lord Dunsany that, or have a quick look at Celtic mythology or Norse mythology, that Tolkien didn't invent them.
Yeah.
And, there are appearances of things like this, but there was always this assumption that epic fantasy was pretty much flowing from Tolkien, and it was ignoring a lot of the other traditions that had fed into it. And one of the ones that consistently I felt was overlooked was the impact of gaming,
Yeah.
because as lit specialists, as literature specialists, we tend to have a bias about where influences come from. And it's, oh, it must have been from these books. And we almost always tilt toward literary influences and we
Yeah.
forget about other narrative media, uh, plays, radio plays, films, television. And of course, the 80s and 90s see an explosion
Yeah.
in accessibility of a lot of these things, which has a knock-on effect. So that's how I got into that, and I then went to a conference in Orlando, of all places. Well, actually, it was in Fort Lauderdale at the time, but it was the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts, which is the International Association of the Fantastic and the Arts annual conference.
Cool.
The IAFA, and then their conference is ICFA.
Okay.
And because of my interest in epic fantasy, and because I had arrived a little early, I was invited out to lunch with Stephen Donaldson and Stephen Erickson, and
Cool.
ended up chatting with them. And that's how I got introduced to Erickson. There's a whole embarrassing story behind that I am not retelling right now. Let's just say that's how I met him. And over the next couple of years,
Off
uh,
camera conversation to come, I would say.
well, it's one that I've told on camera before, which is why I hate telling stories where I have to admit quite how idiotic I am. And I've told this story multiple times.
We can tell
But
that by watching your channel AP, it's fine.
but that was how I met Ericsson. And I then went and after the conference, bought his Gardens of the Moon, Deadhouse Gates, Memories of Ice. I just bought the first three. And I think at that stage, up until I think Midnight Tides had just come out. But I bought the
Okay.
first couple. And I started reading because I was doing my PhD in this topic and I thought this might be interesting. And of course, I had all of my research books that I was reading. I had the primary text, so a lot of fantasy from the 80s and 90s that I was reading through to try and draw any sort of information from it, patterning from it.
Yeah.
And so Gardens of the Moon, then, because it was falling slightly outside of the area of my study, even though Ericsson and Esselmont had both been gamers, they had played D&D, they then moved on to GURPS. It was when it was published was slightly outside of that. So I went, I'll read that when I have time. And one night, I sat down to start it. And, after a long day of doing a lot of reading and a lot of writing, I was like, I'm not really in the mood for this, put it down. Picked it up again, started reading, got to about page 100, and I went, I'm just not in the mood for this. The third time, I think I got to about page 150, and I was absolutely hooked
Yeah.
and put my work on hold for a couple of days while I read the novel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was the beginning of it. That was how I started reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And subsequent to that, because I was meeting up with Ericsson basically once a year at this conference, we became friends. And it was when he was writing Toll the Hounds was
Cool.
When he had asked me, what do you think of this thing? And he had sent me a little section and I gave him feedback on it and then became an advanced reader for him
Cool.
after Toll the Hounds. So Toll the Hounds was the first time I'd sort of done work for Ericsson.
Well, I have a slightly funny story about the first time I became aware of Stephen Erickson. So I wasn't predominantly a fantasy reader as a kid, apart from Harry Potter, and I love
Oh,
Lord of the Rings. Um, but yeah, I'm
those
showing
two kind of
my
balance each other out. You
yeah.
like Lord of the Rings, good. You like Harry Potter, I'll forgive it because you like Lord of the Rings. Okay, well,
You will
moving on.
forgive Harry Potter because I'm of that generation as well. I'm a very young man.
And I'm not.
I'm not implying anything with that. You interpret that however you will, AP. Anyway, I have a funny story about Malazan and how I came to know it. It was, I think, Toll the Hounds was bought for my mother, who by a extended family, and they knew my mother liked to read, and she would occasionally read fantasy. Not really predominantly what she would have read, but it was in the house, like books always in the house growing up. And an extended family member thought, okay, books, we'll buy her a book. And they went out and they bought, it had just come out, a hardcover of Toll the Hounds. Having none of the other books previous to Toll the Hounds, she was presented with this giant 1,300 page monster going, you like books? Here's a big one. And then it sat on the shelf for over a decade. I don't know. I don't remember when the book came out, but I always knew that I wanted to get to it because I like the wolf on the cover, and I was like, that looks like a bit of me. And I don't think I don't think my mother ever went back to buy Gardens of the Moon. But I bought Gardens of the Moon myself a couple of years ago, and I did the same thing as you. I bought the first three, and I was like, I'm gonna get to them. And it still took me a long time to get to them because I started watching BookTube around the same time because I was reading something else. I can't remember. John Gwynn. And I was like, oh, there's reviews of this. Oh, there's a whole corner of YouTube that talks about these books. This is interesting. I should get more into this. And then it was only then that I learned what reputation Malazan has online as this, you know, oh, it's so difficult. Oh, just this 7 rereads and the whatever. Maybe it was just the videos I was looking at, but I kind of just pushed it off until I discovered your channel and Philip, and I got to know Jimmy from the Fantasy Network and chatted to him a little bit, and he was just like, just read it. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna just do that.
I I was completely and utterly unaware that Malazan had any of that reputation before I started recording videos for YouTube. Like
Yeah.
I honestly was absolutely unaware because any of the conversations that I'd had with Ericsson about stuff, or even when I'd gone to occasional readings when he and I were in the same part of the world, and I'd pop by to a reading that he was doing, and the interactions with some fans on it was Malazan Empire. They had a fan forum that I wasn't exposed. I didn't go to Reddit or
Yeah.
YouTube or any of those sorts of things. That wasn't what I was interested in. Wasn't what I was doing. And so I was absolutely unaware that it had any sort of reputation because, it's a book. I
Yeah,
study fantasy. So you go,
yeah,
here's a bunch of fantasy books. I'm going to read them. Oh,
yeah.
it's this style and it's doing this thing. And oh, this is written in this style. This is reminiscent of. And my attitude to literature, BA, MA, PhD, that you go, yeah, but they're just books. That's all they are. They are books.
And
Um,
and I actually don't think that they're all that difficult to read.
no.
I really don't. And it's a big part of why I want to make the videos that I'm making as well, because I want to be a sort of a, regular Joe Soap talking about these big books.
Well, I think part of the reasons why part of the reason why I think some people find Malazan hard to read are based in the assumptions we make about what a story should do. Like we have, particularly if you've been reading a lot of a particular type of fiction, you go,
Yeah,
this is how a story should be told because I know this from all of the fiction that I've read, but we're reading a very small sample of what literature is,
yeah,
and therefore our preconception about how story should function is based on that, not on an understanding of how story functions. The second thing is if you've read a lot of fantasy and even a particular type of fantasy, you have expectations about structure, character, progression, ideas of narrative sequencing, causal events. You have expectations about explicit morality being explored. You have a lot of expectations in the background in your head that quite often you're unaware of. And when a text is written that is both engaging with and trying to deconstruct aspects of that,
hmm
there's a sense of cognitive dissonance that you go, well, hang on, I like if this was a normal fantasy novel, we'd be turning left here, and they've turned right,
yeah,
and that can be difficult if you're not expecting it or are not used to, well, let me see what the book is doing rather than I have my expectations, oh, it's not doing the thing I want, and you end up reading against the text. So I
yeah.
think that's potentially one aspect. A second aspect is fantasy since the 80s and 90s, a lot of commercial fantasy has been heavily denigrated because it was written for a particular market of consumption of story, not for reading and understanding as literature. That it was there was a very dismissive term that I actively dislike, but it was extruded fantasy product and
Okay.
highly derogatory term for a
Yeah.
particular type of commercial fantasy storytelling.
Sounds like production line fantasy.
And you see this a lot in academic circles where they talk about, literature with a capital L and commercial fiction,
Yeah.
which has no art to it. You're like, oh, go away. Like it's such an old-fashioned approach. But within fantasy as a commercial genre, again, you have texts that run the absolute gamut of these things.
hmm
But a lot of the times we start with children's and YA fiction that we love, and then we follow that and we get locked into, oh, well, I really like this thing. So you keep reading more things like it instead of maybe expanding outwards, looking at other genres, looking at more difficult or more complex or things that are just written in a different way or exploring different types of stories. And those patterns that we establish can become limitations in how we understand fiction
Yeah.
because we're not breaking them down. We're not thinking about other approaches. You go, no, it has to start with an introduction. There has to be a main character. Then there has to be an instigating event. Then you go, no, no, that's one form of storytelling,
hmm
and it's great. We see it everywhere, but it doesn't mean that it's the only form of storytelling. And that that I think makes sometimes it difficult for certain readers to get into Malazan, and you're like, and it's
hmm
absolutely fine. The other is it starts in media res. People make a big
Yes. That
people
was the
make a big
one
deal out
thing.
of it.
It was the one thing about Gardens of the Moon that I just really loved is, oh, we're going to do the big battle at the beginning, and then we're going to explore and go off, and everybody's going to, figure things out after the fact. I loved it. it gave it a sense of mystery, you know?
But one of the things I find so curious about this, people go, "Oh, Malazan starts in media res, and this is difficult." It's so difficult that this concept has a Latin term because it's been around that long. This is not a new thing. This is something that we see in a lot of fiction and a lot of storytelling. So often, in fact, it has its own term, and this term has existed for centuries.
Yeah.
This, but because it's not common to do this, particularly within certain areas within fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not common, people go, but where's my introduction? Where's my and we don't develop the same uh, comfortable comfortable approach to yeah,
Yeah.
but if it's important, I'm going to find out about it. So let's
Yeah.
just follow along and see where this goes.
Finding
Uh,
your feet as you go, which I feel like I just feel like, to me, and it might sound dismissive of other writing or whatever, but to me that's just good writing. Like, you find your feet with the book as you go. That's the whole point of reading the book, is I'm not being told everything up front, so I know exactly where I'm going at the end of it, which is something that I find frustrating in a lot of like typical quest fantasy books. Is you're told up front, here's all of the rules of the world, here's who these characters are, and this is where we're going to get by the end of it. And then there's all this sludge that you have to get through to get to
that's a
the
very
end.
mean way to describe it.
It's Tad Williams' Stone of Farewell is a book of sludge.
Oh, that,
That's
but
harsh. I take it back. I take it back.
yeah,
It's a good book.
but and also, but Williams' writing is actually like it's
Beautiful. It's beautiful.
engaging writing that you can. It doesn't matter that you know potentially where a story is going,
Yeah.
particularly because you're so engaged with how it is being expressed, and you're in this moment, and it is so wonderfully immersive because of this beauty that is being expressed on the page. Like people sometimes go, "Oh, like the obsession online with spoilers is one of the things that I still can't wrap my head around."
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you recall, like M Night Shyamalan, Shyamalan, M,
Shyamalan. M. Night
yes,
Shyamalan.
I'm sorry, it's one. Occasionally, I trip over words. His surname is one that I quite frequently trip over. But if you remember, there was a film, The Sixth Sense, and it was there's going to be a big twist, and the thing was, the big twist was revealed in the trailer. Like
Mm-hmm.
everyone saw that trailer where I see dead people. People went into the film knowing the twist. And but it was still a really engaging film because you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to know when this was going to happen, why was it going to
How?
happen, what was
Yeah.
going to happen because of it, how was it going to affect things. Those are some of the most engaging aspects of story that okay, fine, with a murder mystery like an Agatha Christie novel, if someone tells you who the killer is, that can be really annoying because part of the first time that you read something like that is the puzzle of trying to figure it out,
Yeah.
trying to figure it out faster than the detective.
Mhm.
But we also get pleasure out of rereading it.
Yeah.
Well, why would that be? If we already know you, because now when I reread, I know who the person is, and I want to see, can I pick up, are those clues all there? That people are obsessed with, don't tell me anything, but I need to know this thing, but don't tell me anything else.
Yeah.
When it is such a limit, again, it's one approach to enjoying narrative. And
Mm-hmm.
if that's what people want to do, that's what people want to do. But it is so restrictive then when it comes to talking about books because people are like, well, I don't want any spoilers.
Yeah.
But this is a minor detail in the world. This is not spoiling any major element. Like I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't tell you what happens at the end of Toll the Hounds because that's a major element of the storytelling that no, we don't want to give away. I'm not going to tell you what happens in the crippled god because that's a major element that you haven't gotten to yet. But if I said, oh, well, that book's or this book that is coming up is starting on a different continent with different characters, you've
Yes. Yeah.
spoiled it. You're like,
Yeah.
no, but that you find that out in the first scenes.
Yeah.
Chapter one, you realize this. This is not giving away huge elements. Or if I take a section from one of those later books and I remove the character names
Yeah.
to show you a sequence of stuff, I'm not giving anything away. You don't know who it is. And you've read Deadhouse Gates.
Mhm.
One of the covers of Deadhouse Gates features a character being crucified.
Yeah.
Oddly appropriate for today to be talking about this. But so it features a character being crucified. And someone said, that's a spoiler. You know, it wasn't until you mentioned it. Because if someone hasn't read the book, they don't know what it is. It's just someone being crucified. They don't know who the character is. They don't know in what circumstance. But as soon as you say that's a spoiler,
You make them
that
aware.
spoils this major element. People are
Yeah.
like, oh, right. So now you've actually told them something that it's a fantasy cover. Not all fantasy covers reflect actual things that happen in the novel.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's what is it as the kids say? It's a vibe. And
Well done, AP. Well done. It's a vibe.
don't you condescend to me, young man. Doesn't it sound weird when I say things like it's a vibe? It
It,
it
it
doesn't sound
sounds weird.
natural.
It sounds weird to me when I say it's a vibe.
But people get so upset about it. And even if you said, oh well, okay, so it's a spoiler, someone gets crucified in it. There are two major sequences where that comes up, and there's a third other sequence where that comes up. You're like, so which was it? Oh well, it was clearly that one. Yeah, but no one knew that until they read the book. It hasn't spoiled anything about the book except
Yeah.
telling you that someone might get crucified in it. That's that's not revelatory.
Yes.
And I think spoilers are now being used instead of something that if you knew would actually damage the narrative, that
Mhm.
it gives away a significant proportion of the narrative that should be a surprise. That's what we used to refer to as a spoiler. But now it's any information.
Yeah.
And that's a very broad definition of spoiler that
Yeah, and it's even like when thinking about making videos about talking, even myself talking about the books that I've read, I'm thinking, okay, so I can talk about Gardens of the Moon in a non-spoiler way, but even I feel like some of the things I mentioned in the video, there's definitely going to be somebody on the internet who will say, you can't tell me that it starts with the battle and then we go off and do, because that's a huge spoiler. It gives away the
chapter
entire book.
two.
It's chapter two. But like, um, I think even just for my own sanity of talking about these books, post book two, when I finish Memories of Ice, which by the way, I'm like 300 pages in, and it's
Oh, so just at the start then.
yeah. So so it's wonderful so far, but I can't believe I've read 300 pages of a book and I'm still only a fraction of my way through the book. But anyway, I feel like from this point forward, I just need to talk about the books in depth. Like, how can I keep it spoiler free after this? Or like, is there even a point to doing that in a third book? Like, especially
And
with everything that he's building on from the first two, which,
well, it's when Philip and I were doing our chats about each book, and I think we basically did like one major chat about each book up
yeah.
to we haven't done the Crippled God, which is my fault. It will get done at some point, but it's my fault, and we haven't done it yet, and we won't be doing it anytime soon. But and it's entirely my fault. I admit it. But we did a non-spoiler chat for Philip's channel, just talking about broad themes, talking about specific movements, things that are interesting. That if someone had read up to that point and they went, well, I want to get an insight into this book that I'm thinking of getting, but I don't want things spoiled. You go, it was perfect, and Philip has a much bigger audience than me, so it's more applicable for a general audience.
Hmm.
But the discussions we had on my channel were like, no, we're going to talk about it with spoilers up until this book. We're not going to spoil anything past this.
Yeah.
But the conversations I most enjoy are the ones where you read the book, you think about the book, and then you start thinking about the bits that you want to talk about or what is being communicated from it, not just the plot details, not just
Yes.
those surface level details, a lot of which are fun and they're interesting and engaging. But for me, the most powerful literature is stuff that has a resonance, and that resonance often comes from a thematic or abstract notion that then is being applied. So, you can read Animal Farm. Oh, well, it's just about these talking animals on a farm. You can read Animal Farm going, oh, it's an animal fable form about uh, the death of Lenin and the rise of a particular type of communism into autocratic and authoritarianism.
Hmm.
Or you can look at it as a general fable about power corrupting and look at those different elements that was using that setting in the
Yeah.
USSR and Russia, and then translating it into an animal fable. There are
Yeah.
different levels, and we take our own knowledge and appreciation
Yeah.
and we apply that and we find what speaks to us about the story. And those things are fascinating because individual readers respond in different ways.
And I
And
think also the things we the small things that we might project onto that to then analyze or, figure out what this is saying to me, I think is also a perfectly uh, valid and important part of that process as well, because it adds your individuality to the book, to the experience.
and it teaches you about the kind of reader you are.
Yeah.
You learn more about yourself and what you project.
Yeah.
There's a setting that is evoked. I won't tell you where. I don't want to spoil it, but there's a setting that it is evoked at a certain point in Malazan, and certain people go, "This is clearly about America," and they are absolutely positive. They are absolutely confident. This is about America. And then someone else who is equally confident and equally sure, no, no, this is about the British Empire. And then someone else is going to point out, well, because that's how that individual reader interpreted it.
Yeah.
Because it clearly isn't either one of those things. It has drawn elements from somewhere, has packaged them together in such a way that when we interpret it, the one that we're most familiar with will sometimes shape our perception of the thing in the fantasy world.
Yeah.
And that shows us our own knowledge bases, our biases, unconscious things that we are projecting onto the text, which when we pay attention to, if you see it as very clearly, well, this is clearly about America, you go, right. So there is a certain American centric approach that you are applying. And someone else going, oh, no, this is clearly about the Brit. It's potentially an Anglo-centric approach and
Yeah.
knowledge base that you're applying. That tells us about who we are as readers and how, in seeing other people's responses, we go, can I see this from a different lens? Can I
Yeah.
see why was it I saw it as that thing, but someone else saw it as something else? It can't just be we're from two different parts of the world. We're a lot of people who are reading Malazan, are aware that America exists and that the British Empire existed. Like they have the same knowledge base in some
Hmm.
respects.
Hmm.
Why is it we are picking up on slightly different interpretations? And that is a fascinating thing about understanding yourself, understanding other people, and understanding the text. Because then you can go into the text and go, what is it in this text that was suggesting something?
Well,
And
I think that in itself is interesting as well, because and to, I guess, bring in to where I'm at now in the books, in part two in Memories of Ice, there's a lot of talk of, to me, I guess, the truth of information, or the truth of what people know about what's going on and how they respond to that, which I feel like really started in Gardens of the Moon, but is sort of kicking into gear in Memories of Ice. And misinformation. And he even uses the word misinformation several times in some of the, I guess, council meetings with Rake and Paran and Dujek and blah, blah, blah. Um, by the way, I didn't say this at the beginning, but we'll talk about spoilers up until part one of Memories of Ice. So if you haven't read
okay,
up until Memories of Ice, please leave now.
it's like tough. You now know that dude.
Yeah, yeah. But so that's kind of where I think it might be going with Memories of among other things. But I think with contextually, when he wrote these things, misinformation was a word that absolutely meant the same thing that it does now, but it has somehow extra weight now because of social media and everything that's going on now, and the fact that we talk about misinformation all the time in a political context now because of social media or whatever. But also, even with Gardens of the Moon, which I kind of want to talk to you as well about symbolism and how he uses that. But to me, the biggest thing in Gardens of the Moon was the coin thing and this sort of, I guess, free will or agency.
Mhm.
Agency being the topical word, I guess, or one of the topical words of the moment in the way people talk about books. Probably wasn't a thing back in whenever he wrote Gardens of the Moon, the early 90s. It probably wasn't something that people talked about, oh, this character's agency or this character as whatever. But it's an interesting thing to see now and get it now. Um, you know what I'm trying to say? Of like,
Yeah, well, but it's basically a new way of thinking about psychological realism within a text. And of course, psychological realism wasn't always a dominant form of character design.
yeah,
You can go back to the 19th century texts and you go, and how many of them are psychologically real people? How many are caricatures? How many are functions of plot?
hmm,
How many are two-dimensional but really interesting and fun? But they weren't necessarily representative of a psychologically real character.
yeah,
And as literature develops and things become more important or weighted to certain cultures at certain times and appreciated, then they become the norm. And then someone thinks of it in a different way, in a different approach. And thinking about agency, you think, well, why is agency so important in the modern day? Well, what about all of the social and economic pressures that people feel under, where they are feeling constrained, where they are feeling under pressure, where they are feeling all of these things pushing down, where they no longer have the control in their lives that they thought they were going to have?
hmm,
Therefore, agency as a concept within a fictive reality becomes a much more appealing and interesting topic to talk about because of the feeling of lack of agency in our
yeah,
own world.
yeah,
Um, and there's a armchair psychology view of that for one potential reason why agency in terms of psychological realism is becoming of interest or a hot topic to talk about. But these characters are not real. They
hmm,
are not real people. They are functions of plot. And one of the tricks that authors pull is they take a plot function and they make them appear real. They make us think about them as if they are actual people when they aren't. And we respond to that. They've done studies where they hook up people's heads to like MRIs and they scan the centers of your brain while you're reading and they look at the reactions. And we readers typically think of characters as real people. We are imagining these things happening, even though we're also at the same time aware this is not real, it is fiction.
hmm,
And it's this wonderful paradox of reading. We want things, and I don't like using the term realism or realistic. I
yeah,
prefer the terms authentic and verisimilitudinous, because applying realism to a text has a specific meaning and function.
hmm,
And if we only ever apply it selectively, we're not really wanting the text to be more realistic. We're going, no, no, I don't mind all of these aspects being fantastical or artificial, but this one particular thing, I want this to be realistic.
yeah,
But that's going to depend on the individual reader. But if we talk about something and we go, this is internally inconsistent, or this is a very cohesive approach, or this creates a sense of authenticity about the world because the characters within this fictive reality are acting in a consistent manner. Those are all things that we can talk about without applying a false lens selectively of realism. And when we talk about verisimilitude within it, this projection of a feeling of truth. Like I've
hmm,
often facetiously refer to fiction as pretty lies, and that authors are brilliant liars. They tell us the most beautiful lies. But one of the reasons why these stories are so powerful when we read is because at the core of these pretty fictional lies are inherent truths or are powerful truths or are asking questions that go to the truths that we hold in ourselves and
Yeah.
say, are those actual truths, or is there another way to look at this?
Yeah.
And they explore those things. So that's why I think realism, as a mode to approach literary analysis, has its place. It's useful, and it's more useful for certain stories than other stories.
Hmm.
But you don't apply realism to Animal Farm.
Yeah. Of
Well,
course.
how did the pig suddenly learn how to walk upright? That's not how pig physiology works.
Hmm.
You don't apply realism to it because that's not what the thing is.
Yeah.
And so it's an ill-fitting approach. But thinking about the consistency with which certain things are done, you go, oh, this is an interesting dynamic that we can discuss. And just different approaches for different people and different narratives.
Yeah. So I also wanted to talk about I guess people's perceptions of Erickson's characters and characterization. Because it's something I've come across now since starting the books that, maybe some people have criticisms of characterization. And I sometimes find that maybe because you don't get every 5 sentences an internal thought or an internal, sort of musing about this situation. This is how I feel in this current moment in time. Um, it's more coming out through the actions of the characters.
Mhm.
Do you think one way is no, that's not how I wanted to phrase that question. Do you think that there is a perception of how Erickson does it is simply not good writing um because of that? Because
I,
I personally think like it's just another form of characterization, the way he is showing you how these characters act and react.
yeah, for instance, like the there are a couple of different points here. So first is what we mean by characterization. Characterization is how the intrinsic qualities or the qualities of a character are demonstrated and communicated to a reader. That's what characterization is. But again, as we were talking about different forms of narrative, even within the fantasy genre, there are approaches that are taken with this where someone goes, right, we're going to follow a very limited number of characters. They're going to be our limited points of view. We're going to get inside their head so you know what their motivations are. We're going to see how they react to situations. We're going to have other characters talk about them and explain what the person did. That there's a very explicit, and I know this word is loaded in these discussions, but telling of what the character is.
Hmm.
Now, telling in and of itself is not a bad thing. All narrative, well, I shouldn't say all, almost all narratives function by balancing showing certain things to a reader and telling the reader certain things.
Yeah.
Almost all narratives have a balance of these things. And quite often we have a preference toward one particular style. But when it is taken to either extreme, that can affect even us who like that particular thing. And it doesn't even it doesn't even address whether or not the author has achieved that particular style particularly well or struck the right balance. Those are all questions about it. It's not that showing is how you must do things and it's the only good thing and telling is bad. It's like,
Yeah.
no, telling, it can be incredibly important and very, very effective. But so with characterization, if we are used to understanding character through very explicit information that is overt and clear and made clear to the reader, then finding something that is disguising or coding that information can make it feel that the characterization isn't there
Hmm.
because the things we recognize as characterization, the things that we are used to communicating characterization, are not present in the text.
Yeah.
So if those aspects are not in Gardens of the Moon, Erickson obviously doesn't do characterization. No, doesn't do that form of characterization. And again, it's not a question of one way is better than the other. They all suit different narratives. But Erickson's approach is a very well established approach in literature. You find across all genres of, yeah, there's this character, and how they reacted to a situation tells you about that character.
He's
If
also not
someone,
completely like or like he doesn't completely avoid also giving you a little bit of exposition every now and then. He
yeah,
gives quite a lot actually, and but I found in the 2 and 1/10 of the books that I've read so far, it's it's a nice balance, and it's enough that it doesn't feel like I'm being beaten over the head with, okay, you really want me to know this, you know?
it's like, so you get into a chapter and it's like, and he stood there. He was a tall man. And you go through this whole thing describing who this person is. He looked at them sternly, and everything made explicit. And you go, that it makes things clear, it makes things unambiguous. We get a sense of who this character is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've chosen a different style of narrative point of view, where you're limited to what a character sees, hears, smells, tastes, you're limited to that, and they're looking at it, they can't tell you what the other person is thinking.
Yeah.
They can't, because they aren't going to know. They can make guesses about it. They might say, "Why are you so angry?" And the other person, "I'm not angry." But there are all of these things about, even when we are with a character point of view, and how they see something, how they perceive it, what they view as important information, and how they think about that thing that they have perceived. That is revelatory about character. A real estate agent, a realtor, or walking into a building is going to view it in a very different way to, say, potentially someone who knows nothing about real. They might go in and go, "Oh, look at the square footage. Look at all the," and they, if you were getting their point of view, they'd have this whole list of the square footage and what they can maybe do with it, and they can visualize what this space is.
Yeah.
But someone else who is, they walk in and go, "Oh, look at all of the grime all over the floor. Oh, those are horrible tiles." They're noticing something completely different. So even if you have a description of what this room is, the actual information is being highlighted by the author, by the narrator, sorry, I should say. If it is from a character point of view, that order of information, what they are picking up, how they are talking about it or thinking about it, how they characterize it, all of that is actually a reflection of that character if this style is being used.
Yeah.
And for me, that is fascinating. And it is one of those styles that I so greatly enjoy, that
Mm-hmm.
I love picking up on subconscious cues,
Yeah.
on these subtextual levels, or the connotations of things, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the subtextual stuff that is being communicated. You see it a lot in Hemingway. And not to say that Erickson and Hemingway are the same type of writer, but the technique is the same, deployed in slightly different ways. And it's the same with when a, let's say you have a male character and a female character comes in. And if that male character basically gives you a head to toe description of the female character, you've gone, "Oh, because that male character has just looked them up and down. Like they've just done that." And that's what they've described to the reader.
Yeah.
But if, let's say, for instance, the male character is gay and a female character comes in, you might get a completely different description because they are not interested in the female character in the same way. You go,
Yes.
that is actually reflective of the type of character. It's telling you something about the character, therefore, it is a form of characterization. And you can have the same if it's someone is asexual or someone is a military person and a female warrior walks in. So you have a male warrior and a female warrior walks in. They mightn't give the same type of physical description, but they might note what weapons that the person has, what armor they have, how they move. Because for a warrior, seeing another warrior approach them, those are going to be the salient points,
Yeah.
not what her hairstyle was. And that actually tells you something about the character doing the perceiving, as
Yeah.
well as giving you information about the character that has just walked in.
You
And
learn what they think is important or what they look for. Yeah, exactly.
and that is such a wonderful technique that, um, if you're not used to it, if you are looking for those direct, either expository or explanatory approaches, or the direct um, feeding of information to you, and you're not looking at these clues, then you're going to get the impression that the characterization is really weak.
Hmm.
But if you're aware of the clues, and again, it's not about intelligence,
Yeah.
it's about being aware of a different literary technique.
Hmm.
And as soon as you're aware of it, you go, oh, I now see this in all of these different things. It's almost like you're seeing a different book
Yeah.
because you've clicked a different sort of lens in front of your eyes between you and the book. And you go, ah, I know what's going on here now.
Yeah.
And if you're unfamiliar with it, you can't do that.
And I would hesitate to call any of the characters unreliable narrators, because I don't think he writes unreliable narrators. I think he just writes characters that view things the way we all view things, with our own preconceived initial bias, informed by our surroundings, our education, what we do, like how we've grown up, who we work for. And I like seeing all those different perspectives, you know? I
And
think he
and
really, really does that well.
and part of that is unreliable narration refers to two different concepts. One is levels of trustworthiness, and one is levels of information.
Hmm.
So subjectivity.
Hmm.
Um, and they both are referred to as unreliable narration. And a lot of what Erickson plays with the focalization that occurs in the chapters or the points of view is subjectivity.
Yeah.
That someone cannot have knowledge of what's happening in the other room. And therefore, if they walk into that room, that's when we get the impression and they can misunderstand what has just happened. You used to see this a lot in, all of those comedies in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s of, two people are sitting chatting and they say, oh,
The two
the
Ronnies.
husband's coming home, but the husband's coming home. And then suddenly there's oh, I have this whipped cream. Oh no, it's all fallen over you. And then they slip and they fall and they're lying on the ground covered in whipped. Then the husband walks in at exactly the wrong moment.
Yeah.
And it's, oh, what's going on here? And say, but it's perfectly innocent when it looks anything but. That's so if we were with the husband's POV and we didn't see that whole sequence, and all you saw was him walking up to the door, he opens the door, and then you see the scene and leaps to a conclusion, leaps to an understanding of the scene. You wouldn't say that that's an unreliable narrator, but that's effectively what unreliable narration can do because it's not about an objective transmission of all of the information of the scene. It is limited to a very subjective perspective,
Yeah.
even if that perspective is trustworthy. And
Yeah.
that's the other thing that we have some unreliable narrators who, yes, everything they say, you could be a lie, but they are deliberately lying to the narratee, to the reader, that they are not being truthful.
Hmm.
But they have full knowledge of everything that happened and are choosing not to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And you can see how those are two different things, even though we call both of them unreliable narration.
Hmm.
But trustworthiness and subjectivity are tend to be more useful terms.
Yeah. Um, Another thing I wanted to talk about as well is how Erickson uses setting. Now, obviously, I have only read two of his settings so far, but two distinctly different books in terms of tone and in terms of theme for me, um, and pacing as well. So I was kind of thinking, do you think, well, obviously you speak to Erickson a lot, but do you think that he uses setting deliberately as a contributor to tone, theme, and pacing, in a sense that, like with Gardens of the Moon, you have a lot of taverns and tight spaces and corners and alleyways and rooftops and people jumping around from roof to roof, and it kind of mimics the pacing and the tone of the book itself. It's quite fast. It's quite a fast-paced book in the general sense.
Mhm.
Um, Quite a chaotic book, and it kind of bounces quickly from POV to POV as well, quicker than I found with Deadhouse Gates. But with Deadhouse Gates, he uses the vast desert of Raraku, which is long and arduous, and the book itself is about perseverance and the book reads a bit more like that. Not that it's an arduous book to read, but I feel like the reading experience echoes his settings. And I want to ask if you think he does that deliberately.
Yeah, very much so. Erickson is a very deliberate and intentional writer. You know,
Mhm.
he was trained as a short story writer, and you know when you're reading short stories that because of the limitations of word count, that you're trying to use setting and character and narrative event and dialogue and every single aspect of that story you're trying to use as a cohesive self-supporting network to transmit the story, that every single aspect should be, or you try to make communicate the story,
Yeah.
and you tend to tie these things in. But some of it is also, and again, it all depends on execution, and people don't have to agree that Erickson is the best at this. Like,
Mhm.
I think one of Esselmont's books, um, Blood and Bone, has one of the best evocations of setting as character. Um, but you haven't read it yet, so we won't talk about that. But when we think of, if someone said, "Oh, it's a big epic fantasy," when in the 80s and 90s, if someone said epic fantasy, you go, "Oh, pseudo medieval, pseudo Europe." That's the fantasy land. But what we see in a lot of the Malazan world from both Erickson and Esselmont is a deliberate use of different styles of landscape because they didn't want to do the pseudo medieval, pseudo European quest narrative. That wasn't what they wanted to write. They wanted to write against that. So there are choices made about setting to try and make something a bit different. And then, as you point out with Deadhouse Gates, that long walk that you take with Duiker, that march with the chain of dogs, it is barren, it is desolate, it is one foot after the other. You are trudging along with them. Now,
Yeah.
imagine you change that to, oh, well, there are beautiful green fields everywhere and orchards.
Yeah.
Would it have the same impact? Would it work the same way? And you go, no, the setting actually really fits with the story that's being told.
Hmm.
The when we just before we started recording, I had mentioned that if you were writing a gothic story, the immediate setting that you might think of would be like the old mansion or old stately home or old castle, that you go for that sense because it ties into notions of the gothic. Does that mean you have to use that setting for the gothic? Of course not.
Hmm.
But certain settings are the sort of the obvious ones to lean into for a narrative.
Yeah.
But if you're going to change it, you're aware that you've changed this pillar of the narrative. So what you're putting in its place, you have to figure out how the narrative is going to work with that, what you're going to do with it. And setting is quite often one of those aspects that people either talk about in terms of world building and don't think of the connection to narrative,
Yeah.
or it's one of those things that the setting is just the ground that people are walking across. That's all it is. They can make it as cool as possible. Awesome. How does it impact the narrative? How does it tie in with the themes that are being communicated, the tone or the atmosphere that this thing is? And like I said, with the chain of dogs, it wouldn't have seemed quite so harsh, quite so arduous, quite so stressful
Hmm.
if they were walking along in soft rolling hills of beautiful countryside with plenty of food and water everywhere. That desolation was intimately tied to
Yeah.
the narrative experience of the chain of dogs. And so when we have those moments of relief, when we get to those moments where there is a river crossing, when we get to the breaking up of this, those moments gain additional weight because it's breaking up this journey. It's a moment of change, a moment of respite, a
Hmm.
moment to refill water casks and actually, take a break. They carry more weight because of that, because it was in this other setting.
Yeah.
Um, like, what did you think of the use of those settings in Deadhouse Gates.
I mean, I felt, especially with the color tones, I always see color tones as well when I read. I'm a bit of a visual reader as well, but even just how the characters speak is a lot more. We're in this for the long haul, and you know, whatever the outcome may be, this is the path we're walking. And even the way the characters speak to each other, it adds this kind of oppressive nature to it all. And I loved that. Like I loved feeling that. It's not the easiest book in the world to read in that sense. Like not that it's difficult to understand, but it's not a difficult book, or it's not an easy book to read in that sense. But I like that because it got it got that emotion out of me, and I felt like it wanted to get that emotion out of me, if that makes sense. So I appreciated it on that level. Um, and the whirlwind itself, and the sandstorms, and the constant fear of the chain of dogs biting its own tail, and having this kind of loop of we're always looking behind as well to see what's coming, and doom is right ahead as well, and the whole tragedy of the end of it as well is getting so close. Which it's like a big Greek tragedy, and whereas the first book I felt like was a political thriller with all of the alleyways and the secrecy and the cabals, and the desert was just this long biblical journey, and it felt like that.
But even thinking about the chain of dogs, and you get that the color ochre, which is one of the
Okay,
ones
yeah,
that people
yeah.
people like to bring up, but dry and dusty. But if you actually go through textually, there are moments when they are like when they get to those rivers and there are trees and it's
Hmm.
fertile and there are long grasses. You suddenly realize they're not walking across like the Sahara Desert, but there are moments of it when they're walking across quite desolate land. But then it's more like the rolling steppes or the Canadian prairies,
Yeah.
uh, which obviously like an area that Erickson and Esselmont both know very, very well, being Canadian archaeologists who had to go out onto the prairies to do things. But that again is a slightly different landscape, and it gives us a different sense. And as it changes through the book, that sense of movement and progression,
Hmm.
that it adds to a flavor of the new, so that the reader doesn't get bored that it's just the same old thing over and over again.
Yeah.
But it also communicates how far that they have traveled. They're moving through actual areas that have different vegetative norms. That if you think like walking from the bottom of Ireland to the top of Northern Ireland, there isn't a huge variation in that landscape. Like
Hmm.
you go through towns, you go through cities, but let's face it, we don't have massive mountains. We
Hmm.
have some, but a lot of it is fields and we don't have huge forests. But you're in roughly the same landscape all the way through.
Hmm.
But if you walked east to west in the US, if you walked across that, you'd be going through, from the coastal area into these mountains, down into the plains. Then there might be a desert. Huge variation as you're walking through these different zones.
Yeah.
And that communicates something about the world as well.
Hmm.
And so all of these are different techniques that lots of authors use, and some use it to better effect than others, about using the setting as a way to support aspects of the narrative.
And it
That
wasn't just, sorry to cut across you, it also wasn't just the length of the book that made the ending that more tragic, where they make it but they don't make it. Um, it's also that they get to these moments where there's a little bit of respite. Oh, they get to a river, but then, they have to cross that river rather difficultly. Um, I think those moments contribute, along with the length of the journey itself, to that tragedy at the end, and that feeling that compounds it.
because and one of the things that I've often heard people say about the chain of dogs section, Erickson could have made it shorter. Yeah, Like almost every author can make their work shorter. Like that's what would making it shorter do? Would you have felt the same uh, fatigue
Hmm.
coming from the book, knowing how tired these people were if it had been shorter? And then to see the city just ahead, to know
Yeah.
that the city is just there. And you, as a reader, are feeling this, they're going to make it. You have been with them on this journey. And because the journey has, been so long, because you've been down in the trenches with them, because you have been choking on the dust as they walk along, because you have suffered these losses over and over again, that now that salvation is so close, you have an emotional investment that has been built up incrementally. If you
Yeah.
shorten that, the emotional investment is shortened. It doesn't get to the same heights. Now, does that mean there would be no emotional investment? Of course not. You still would be at least some way invested in it, but it wouldn't necessarily get to the same level.
Yeah.
And, this is one of the things that we sometimes struggle with. An individual reader could say, yeah, but I got that point 200 pages ago. I didn't need any of them more. But another reader might say, oh, but no, I didn't get to that point until 50 pages ago. And this is clearly where Erickson thought that this was as long as it needed to be to create the effect that he wanted to create in his readership. But Erickson cannot know what every individual reader is going to respond to. It's his best guess. And that's why, like, it'll work for some people, it won't work for others. But I think for the majority of us, when we see and go through that march,
Hmm.
we are so invested in this that when we realize that they are not going to make it, when we realize that Coltian is going to die in sight of the city walls, that hits us so much harder. Here is Sanctuary, and they are almost within spitting distance of Sanctuary and safety and true absolute success.
Hmm.
And it is ripped away from them. That's what makes, for me at least, that's what makes it so compelling. If it had just been, oh yeah, like the Lord of the Rings. Oh, they walked out. He walked for months on end and then got to the volcano and threw the ring in. Oh, what a stirring story!
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to be with the character on certain journeys because it's through those journeys, it's through experiencing their hardship that we understand their sacrifice. And so the Lord of the Rings wouldn't have worked. Oh, why didn't they just get on the Eagles? Ignoring all of the other arguments. Oh, so they got on the Eagles and threw the ring. All right, great.
Hmm.
Where's the story? Where's the emotion?
Hmm.
Oh, well, it just made it happen faster.
Also,
Yeah.
to bring it back to my previous slander of Stone of Farewell by Tad Williams, if the book was just we need to go to the Stone of Farewell, we have arrived at the Stone of Farewell, it would have been even worse. And
I've
also,
just
I
called
do
a
not.
magical Uber.
Yeah, yeah. Also, I do not think Stone of Farewell is a bad book for anybody watching who likes that book. I just think it's a little too long.
And this is one of the issues that I think a lot of us have. We go, I thought this was too long.
Hmm.
And if we recognize that, well, I thought this was too long, and some other people think it was too long, but there must be other people who go, no, I wanted to spend more time there. That we
Absolutely.
realize that it's not necessarily that the book was too long,
Hmm.
it's that this was longer than it needed to be for me.
Yeah,
And we think those two statements are the same, but they're actually
they're
very
very,
different
very
statements.
different. Yeah.
And that is one of the things that I think that we struggle with, particularly with social media and online communication and a lot of these things that we say, oh, this felt a little long to me. And well, it was the perfect length for me. Right, great. But it felt a little long for me.
Hmm.
Or other people saying, this was too long. It should have been shorter. You're like, but this was the length that I wanted it to be. It worked for me. It wouldn't have had the same effect on me if it had been shorter.
I think that's what I like about BookTube as well, like just the space to have these, in-depth discussions. And people do take a bit of time not everybody, people do take a bit of time to really think about not necessarily the word choice, like you don't have to pass an exam or whatever, but just to think a little bit more deeply about what it is you're saying and why you're saying it. Um, I think
Yeah,
this space is pretty good at that, actually. You know?
we have long form content that we can create. We have discussions. We can be slightly more nuanced, and we can explore certain points that we want to explore. Like, no matter what video I think I've ever done, someone said, "Well, why you didn't cover that point?" You're like, yeah, I know, but like, I can't cover every single point in every single topic because otherwise the videos would be 14 hours long and I'd just be exhausted all
Yeah,
the time. There are some things that I want to talk about. There's other things that I forget. It's I don't have a script when I record videos. I have, oh, I thought of this thing. Let me go and let me organize it in my head. And I might write down 2 points and go, right, I'm going to talk about these 2 points. And
yes,
I'll have a note. And that's it. That's what I have to try and talk about because I want to talk about these things as they pop into my head.
yeah,
I know not everyone is like that. But it's like when we talk about reviewing a book and people say, oh, well, this is how I felt when I read it. Great, but that's not reviewing the book. That's telling me how you felt. And how you felt while reading can be useful in the review of a book, but it's not a review of the book
mhm,
because it's all about how you felt in the moment that you read it. And if you reread it 10 years later, you're not going to feel the same way.
mhm,
And therefore, your review is going to change. But if you're reviewing the book, the review would stay the same because you're focused on the book.
yeah,
If your review radically changes, it's not because the book has changed, it has remained constant. It's because how you felt changed. And therefore, what you have done in your review is you've talked about how it made you feel. You've talked about your reading experience. You've talked
mhm,
about your response to the book. All very useful and interesting information, but not a review of the book.
yeah,
And that's that's one of the difficulties I think we have in the modern day is when we talk about a book review, we conflate how we felt when we read with what the book is. And that that can be a difficult thing to negotiate.
mhm,
This was a 5-star read. I reread it. It's a 1-star read. How which of your reviews was wrong then?
yeah, yeah,
Because oh, well, clearly the first one was wrong, and then you read it again 10 years later. Oh, that's a 5-star read again. You're like, what? How can it constantly change like this? The book
mhm,
doesn't change. The only thing that is changing is you. You're reading it at different points in your life. And therefore, you're actually what you're talking about, what you're evaluating is how you felt. And
the the rereadability of these books is something that I'm noticing as well, and I think it's you get it with great books like you know Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, like these books that have are so rich in detail and subtext and little hints and foreshadowing and yada 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 that I feel like they're written for that purpose. For you read it the first time, you have a certain feeling. And you go back and you reread it, you'll have a different feeling. And obviously, we were talking about it earlier with the context. You have context, it's going to reframe. You pop in a different lens the second time. Um, I think that's why we reread the good stuff.
and but all of the books that we really truly love, um, even outside of the genre of fantasy, but the books that we love, and when you read them again, how many times have I read Pride and Prejudice, and you pick up on different things, you see different things, and I think this is a point that gets made about Malazan that some people say, "Oh, you must reread. Oh, you have to reread the books," and other people go, "Well, if I have to reread it, then it can't have been written well in the first place."
Hmm.
And I think there's a big misunderstanding about that. It's not that you have to reread, but when you reread, you see a lot of connections that you didn't have the context for the first time. And so
He's giving you
it
the
shows you a
option.
different pattern.
Yeah, he's giving you the option for a different experience if you want it. that book's going to have a shelf life.
But you can still enjoy it on the first read.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what's amazing is like, people say, "Oh well, if you can't understand it on the first read, then why bother reading it?" Whereas quite often I'd look at it and go, "Why should I buy a book that I read once and can never go back to because it is worthless to look at again?"
Mm-hmm.
But books that have depth to them are those books that, you read once and you go, "Wow, that was amazing," and then 10 years later, I'll just read. Oh yeah, and you get back into it again. Whereas there are some books that you read and you go, "I never need," they are disposable. I never
Yeah.
need to look at this ever again. There's nothing to this that I need to go back to because it didn't have that depth. It didn't have, and again, people use the term complexity, and sometimes it's applied as a negative,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't have the richness inherent in them that rewards a second look, a third look, a fourth look. You can read Pride and Prejudice once, you understand the basic things that happen, but when you read it again, you start noticing subtleties. And those subtleties open the book up in a different way, and you gain different insight.
Yeah.
I love books that do that because it's not just about the consumption of what happened.
Yes.
And there are stories that I have read and I have greatly enjoyed that are all about the consumption of what happened. They're fun.
Mm-hmm.
But what I want in the genre, what I love to see in the genre, are books of all types. So that if I want one that I can read and then dispose of, awesome. If I want one that I can read and puzzle over, awesome. If I want one that I can read and reread multiple times, awesome. I want that for the genre, that no matter what mood I am in, no matter what I've previously read, there will be something new for me to read.
Yes.
And
And it
it
doesn't
will
make one style better than the other. It's just for that moment, that is the book for you. Yeah.
and there are going to be styles. Like at the minute, um, I have a major preference for certain styles. You go, yeah, but like all things, maybe in 15 years, I'll want to move on to read a different style because that has become, boring, or I'm too used to it and I want something different. It's one of the reasons why reading different genres and different time periods can be so exciting, is you're constantly confronted with different approaches and different narrative styles and different narrative structures and different ways of telling and expressing a story.
Yeah.
And that adds variety. But if I constantly read just the Malazan Book of the Fallen over and over and over again in a loop, I can tell you that I would get extremely bored very quickly
Mm-hmm.
because I'm fickle that way. But I don't see the need for all books to follow the same pattern or all books to use the same style. And even then, like, this is the heyday, the golden age of fantasy storytelling.
Absolutely.
Fantasy at some point is going to tail off because this is what always happens to genres.
Yeah.
And it will happen, and we'll have all moved on. Like the next thing might be uh, Victorian Gothic science fiction or some weird amount. But that'll be the new thing, and it'll rise to massive popularity, and suddenly that will be everywhere. And yeah, I look forward to that time period as well because that's going to be fun.
Apparently, Salem witch romance is a new niche in literature or something. I've heard
How,
this recently.
how is it a new niche? Like Anne Rice had an entire series
Yeah. Yeah.
that was like the Mayfair witches, and
Yeah.
or we could go back to Miller's
Apparently,
The
it's making a
Crucible.
comeback. Sorry, go on.
Oh, making a comeback, fine, but it's not a new niche. It's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's a fairly well established niche.
So talking about like the styles and having different kinds of books in fantasy, it's something as well that we try to talk about a little bit on our channel as well, just because we tend to read quite broadly. We don't necessarily stick to this bubble, and our channel is dedicated to many different genres, which is exactly what YouTube tells you not to do if you want to build an audience. But again, like you, I am fickle. If I tend to not even binge series, so I will read the first book or two in a series, and I'll come back a couple of years later, and I'll be perfectly fine with doing that. People think I'm nuts,
But
but
I'm gonna say, just before you go on,
yeah,
that's how books were published. The idea that you can go out and buy an entire series and then read the whole thing, that is that
thank
only
you.
works with all the other time. Like when you would go out and you go, oh, book one is out, I'll read book one. Oh, this was fascinating. I'm really looking forward to book two. And it could be 1, 2, 3, 4 years later. Book two's
100%.
out. Oh, run down, you get it and you read it. We do this all the time. But I think something about streaming has warped all of our brains that it's, oh, well,
100%.
everything must all, I'm not going to start watching this until all the episodes are, and then I'm going to watch it all in one go.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's binging it is one way to do it, but it's not the only way, nor is it until very recently the normal way.
Yeah, yeah. I just recently even I was I enjoy the Expanse novels. Um I like a bit of, science fiction hanky panky. And I sat on the I sat on the cliffhanger of Caliban's War for I think it was 3 years. And it ends on a cliffhanger, like plot wise, I guess. And I was like, oh, that's a fun cliffhanger. I'm excited to read the third book. And then I go off, I read something else, I go off on a new little thing, and then eventually I know I'll come back to that urge to find out what happened with that cliffhanger. And people I think in the last video I did, I was talking about the third book finally getting back to, and they're like, "You sat on that cliffhanger for 3 years?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. Why not?"
And it's because eventually you'll go, you know what? I really want to find out now. And that's the thing that goes and inspires you to look at the thing.
Hmm.
But I get very, I think I get frustrated and slightly irked with people who project there is one way to do things. Like when people say about writing advice and they go, don't do prologues. Prologues are not what the market wants. If your book needs a prologue or you really want to put a prologue in, put a prologue in because it has to be your story. You have to be telling it that way. Well, your first sentence is really important. You go, congratulations. Like, yeah, it's the first sentence that the reader is going to engage with. So it has to have a hook.
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean by hook? It has to engage the reader's interest. You're like, no shit. Like, are there any other like really blindingly obvious things that you want to say? Oh, it must do these things. Basically, what you're saying is with my first sentence of my writing, I'm to encourage the reader to read on more for the rest of the novel. Yeah, you're aware there's a blurb on the back, and the blurb on the back is making promises about what's in this book. Yeah, but the first sentence is the one that they look at. You go, yeah, but if they've bought the book or they're going to look at, people very rarely just look at the first sentence and go, nope, the first sentence didn't grab me. The first paragraph, the first couple of sentences, the first page, the first 10 pages.
Hmm.
Every reader has a different metric. And the idea that the first sentence has to be the most important sentence, you're like, no, hopefully it's interesting.
I sometimes flip to the middle of a book and read a page to see if I like the writing.
Yeah. I quite often will skim through and then just look at a random paragraph because then I can see how a paragraph is structured, the flow of stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's one of the reasons why I do those prologue videos, or which are sometimes prologues, sometimes preludes, sometimes chapter ones, because not every book is structured the same way. But in essence, something from the start of the book
Great
that,
videos, by the way. I've watched several of those.
because if someone's interested in the book, you go, this is what the writing is like.
Hmm.
Because you can be, I remember talking about Assassin's Apprentice, and it was a review I'd seen of Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, where this person went off on one about how they'd been lied to because they had been promised this action adventure civil war born identity assassin killing people book, and I'm looking at it going, what book did you pick up? None of that. So I went through the first like 4 paragraphs. I go, none of this
Hmm.
is suggested by what is actually here. So if you look at the back, back gives you some things. But then you look at the first page, and from that first page, you can actually gain quite an accurate understanding of the style and type of book that it is. And if
Mm.
you were expecting the born assassin identity crisis, that's on you, my friend.
Yeah.
Um, so like I understand the importance of the first page. I understand the importance of line one, but I think people get really hyper focused on it. And they don't understand that a hook is basically just a way of saying you want to engage your reader's interest. And there are a million and one ways that you can do that.
Yeah.
And what is innovative now, in 5 years' time, might be a cliche. In 50 years' time, might be brand new again. Because
Yeah.
all of these techniques that get used, get noticed and picked up and used by other people, then they suddenly become the norm. And
Yeah.
once they become the norm, then they become passe. Once they've become passe, they become cliche. Once they are cliche, they are bad, never use them, so no one ever does them. And then enough time passes.
Yeah.
Oh, I think, wow, that's so innovative.
Then it
You're
becomes
like,
an homage. Yeah.
the circle of life.
Onions. It's all a cycle. I
that
love it.
that philosopher Shrek, very, very, very
Yeah.
important.
Going back to the difficulty thing, right? And so what you're talking about, this kind of cycle that things go through. Now, now I think obviously the trend is instant gratification or immediacy or
Mhm.
the immediate hook, and not this sort of gradual formation of a tapestry that I feel is the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Um, but I've avoided using, I've tried to avoid using anyway, I don't know, in the videos that I've made, the word dense, because I feel like nowadays the trend of the word dense is, oh, this is going to be homework and this is going to be something that I don't want to read. So I've been using the word rich because I feel like it's, I don't know, a little softer, it's a little easier going, and I feel like it really conveys what these books are so far. Rich in detail, rich in things to ponder, to sit on, to question. But that is also dense, you know?
And again, density of information.
Yeah.
People always talk about, oh, concision in writing is really important. And you go, concision in writing is not using the fewest possible words.
Mhm.
Concision in writing is communicating the greatest amount of information in the fewest possible words. The more that you do that, the denser the writing becomes because there are multiple layers of meaning being communicated by single sentences.
Yeah.
So density of information, we can understand that. But yeah, I think you're right that when people say, oh, the prose is dense, that people view that as a pejorative. And again, I think part of this comes back to expectations and levels of literacy.
Yeah.
Levels of literacy have certainly declined. Um, we don't, the average person doesn't read at the same level now that the average person read at 50 years ago.
Yeah.
The average reading age has decreased. And a lot of people, again, it's not to do with intelligence, it has to do with the skill of literacy and practicing that skill and building that skill. But the more you read, the more literate you can become, particularly if you read other genres, other time periods. You build out and build up a more extensive vocabulary.
Yeah.
Because if you read a very limited subsection of novels, A, brilliant. The fact that you are reading novels is brilliant because there are so many different demands on our time and our attention now that if someone is reading, that is already a win. But if you are reading a small subset, a specific type, you will get used to a certain patterning, not only of narrative structure, not only of style, not only of those things, but also of a register. So let's say you have someone who, like you, was seduced by the Harry Potter books and thought that they were amazing. And from that point on, went, right, I'm gonna reread the Harry Potter books because I love them so much. Great, okay, fine. And then these books, well, they're I want more like Harry Potter. And you're stuck then in that children's and YA bracket. And children's and YA are written for children and young adult audiences.
Mhm.
They're the two major genres that are basically defined by audience, not
Yeah.
by content. And because of that, you're not going to be exposed to the same different styles of narrative. You're not going to be exposed to the same, or you're not
Techniques.
going to be exposed to
Yeah.
different structures.
Mhm.
And the vocabulary being used is quite often going to be more basic, simply because they're aimed at a lower level of literacy.
Mhm.
And that's just the nature of it. And if that is your experience and you're not building your vocabulary elsewhere, then when you come to read something else, you might go, this is really complex language. When actually it's not. It's only a couple of reading ages up, but it feels complex because we haven't encountered it before.
Mhm.
And once we then gain familiarity with it, we go, how could I have ever thought that this was complex?
Mhm.
Until we get to the next sort of stage and we go, oh, this is really complex.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. But that's why literacy is a skill. It's not about intelligence. And the difficulty is because of the I one of the reasons, because of the different demands on our attention, in order to be a commercially successful and make a go of it as an author these days, catering to the largest audience possible means balancing my content level has to be this is not intended for children, but maybe a 12-year-old. So the lowest sort of age range, you're thinking 12 years old. So I'm going to write this for 12-year-olds, that level, because that's the base level that I'm aiming at. I don't want anyone younger than that. You try to have the largest base possible, and that can affect the level of diction used.
Yeah.
And if someone then goes to something that wasn't written to that level, that was written, say, to an assumption that you have an adult, like 18-year-old reading level, if you're used to reading at a 12-year-old reading level, even if you read like 100 pages in 20 minutes, but that's the level you're used to, and
Mhm.
you go to something that was written for an 18-year-old reading level, you go, wow, this is really, I have to slow, I'm only reading 1 page a minute. This is really difficult. And it's
Mhm.
because you're used to a different style.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, one of the issues that we have. And then people feel called out or they feel attacked, going, well, I'm a good reader. I, sure you are. But if your diet is all of these YA books, you're not being exposed to other vocabularies and other ways of doing things. Because YA typically is written in a range that's going to appeal to that audience, and it's not using a lot of these other ways of telling story.
Do you think that then implies in people's minds that they need to read up to something, or that they can dive into something like Malazan and, you know, almost sink or swim or something like
Well,
that?
it's they're all just books,
Yeah.
and as long as as long as you can speak and read the language, like pick up none of these books are too hard to read or too complex. It all depends on what you want from it. If you want something that is easy to read, get something that's written at a lower level. If you want something that is going to be slightly more engaged, get something that maybe is written at a higher level. But
Yeah.
even if you haven't, even if you've spent your whole life reading, just rereading Harry Potter over and over again, and that's the only set of books that you've ever read, yeah, you can immediately read Malazan. It will just take you. You just need to A, take your time, and be open to the fact that it's not written in the same style.
Yeah.
But if you understand the language, you go, because we pick up meaning from context. We do this with new words all the time.
Yeah.
Everyone does this. This is a skill that we have. But I think some people feel, oh, well, I have to read this thing and then I have to, and then I'm going to graduate by reading. That's not how any of this works. Because you could have never read anything like Malazan before in your life, go into it, and yet it is hitting exactly all of the things that you didn't know that you wanted in a book.
Yeah.
Or you could have read loads of fantasy, you go into Malazan and go, I hate Malazan, because it's not doing the things that I like. And you go, that's fine. In matters of taste and preference, the customer is always right.
Yeah.
Is it, does it use words that you might have to look up? Yeah. But so do lots of books. The first time you've ever read a book that says the word necromancer in it, well, what's a necromancer? And unless you know how to break out the etymology of the word and break it apart, you're sort of going to, well, I don't know what a necromancer is. Let me look it up. Or someone using a neuromancer. You know, not a lot, that doesn't trip off the tongue in most everyday conversations. Oh, yeah, and I was down in the shops the other day talking to a neuromancer.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Or
Really?
or Steve Erickson's favorite tone of voice, febrile tone of voice. I didn't know that till I read Gardens of the Moon.
But how else do we learn new words?
Hmm.
Well, I suppose we could sit down and read the dictionary. You know, it's a bit dry, not a lot going on, but at least it explains everything. But how else do we encounter new words unless we read books that we are unfamiliar with? Like that, and for some of us, that's a joy. Other people don't want that. It is too much of an effort. And again, that is absolutely fine. Some people just want to sit down and have an easy, comfortable, exciting read. That's all that they want from the book. You go, brilliant. I am incredibly happy for you. Other people want something that is going to challenge their assumptions or broaden their mind
Hmm.
or have complex plots or have really cool, interesting characters. There are all of these different things. We all read for different reasons, and those reasons may change on different days, even within ourselves. And that's why I keep trying to come back to the point that literacy is not intelligence. And the Malazan Book of the Fallen is no more difficult than any other book. It is just written in a particular style. The more familiar you are with that style and the larger your vocabulary is, the the less effort you will have to put into understanding it because things will appear obvious.
And I think a large goal for me making these videos and just going through them and sort of vlogging myself is saying that, okay, well, I think reading broadly also helps. If you want to pick up these books, you have a sort of a knowledge or a familiarity with, for example, with Gardens of the Moon. It felt like I was reading another spy thriller at times. And I cut my teeth reading spy thrillers as a kid because I had loads in my house. Um, and
But
I
Tom
feel,
Clancy,
yeah, Tom Clancy, Vince Flynn, Ludlum, those guys, yeah.
oh,
Um,
I remember reading the Bourne books,
mhm.
and then when they made the films, I was like, oh, this would be. Oh, they cast Matt Damon. He's a bit younger than I was expecting Bourne to
Yeah,
be.
yeah. I read the first one after the movies, um, and I was like, wow, this is boring. And then I read it again, going, okay, yeah, no, I do like it, but it's still boring.
But
But yeah,
you know,
it reading these broad genres just exposes you to the different forms of storytelling. Like it's a very similar story. There's some changes with the Bourne Identity film and the Bourne Identity book, but it's just a different way of telling that story, you know? And I think people, if you're going into Malazan, um, again, just to like stress the point, it's not like you need to read a certain amount of books to graduate to the level of then reading Malazan. It's just exposing yourself to different styles and different forms will not necessarily then give you that shock factor of, oh shit, what am I reading? The battle on the first page? What? It's you'll be a little more receptive to it. Is yeah.
yeah, and again, I think when we read a lot of one particular thing, we started basically talking about this. We become very set in our ways about how it should be done. And when it doesn't conform to that, because we're constantly looking for how it should be done, we start seeing that when the book doesn't do that, well, this is bad. It's not doing the thing. This is badly done because we're trying to make the book fit. the established paradigm that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So as we said about the characterization, because implied characterization is very much what Erikson is trying to do. You don't have a lot of overt characterization, and therefore people look at it and go, he's bad at characterization because there's no characterization on this page, because what they are seeing is the absence of the thing that they are used to.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean necessarily that Erikson's form of characterization is going to work for you, or even if it's the best example of that type of characterization. But that's the style that he is using.
Yeah.
And so I
Then
get
it's just
frustrated when people say,
yeah.
but when people say he can't do characterization, he can, it's there, look.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, but no. Or when people say, I'm a character reader, this is if you're a character reader, why are you reading fantasy? Like go and read
Literary
literary
fiction.
fantasy
Yeah.
about the young 20 something journalist who's trying to write a novel in a garret in London, or the young 20 something journalist who's trying to write a novel in a studio apartment in New York, or the young 20 something. I might be a wee bit glib about what literary fiction is, but literary fiction is very much focused on character. It is character study after character study. Like that,
Yeah.
you don't typically have big events. You actually just have very few events and very small events, and it's all about the character. And that, if you're a character reader, literary fiction is your go-to. It is amazing
Yeah.
for being a character reader. If you're more interested in big explosive plots and things like that, then yeah, a lot of epic fantasy does that. But spy thrillers and the sort of action thrillers, they do those things. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's so much out there, no matter what our taste is. Other genres can cater to it as well.
Yeah. I have a big question for you that is it might send you on a bit of a but go on, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say, well, the thing is, when a man and a woman love each other very much, they share this special kind of hug. And oh, was it not that question?
AP, could you explain to me where babies come from, please? We can edit that out. No, we're not going to edit that. We're going to leave that in. I wanted to ask you, and it might send you off on a bit of a tangent, but that's fine. What do you think people mean when they talk about accessible prose or inaccessible prose? Because I see it a lot sometimes with, not necessarily with Malazan, a little bit. Reading some like Goodreads reviews, oh, it's a bit inaccessible or whatever. The prose is dense and yada yada yada. And I'm like, fair, but just to use a brief comparison, and for me personally, I read like the first or Scott Baker book, and I sometimes found it a little more inaccessible, where I had to reread things a couple of times to get the gist of a paragraph. So far, 2 and a bit books into Malazan, I have not had that experience. However, the layers of subtext, you know, what do you, there's density, there's richness, there's accessible, there's inaccessible. Where would you draw that line, if there is a line?
Again, I think accessibility is again an ever shifting line in the sand.
Yeah,
If someone is consuming narrative through audiobook, there are certain styles of writing that really lend themselves to audiobook.
mm-hmm.
Things written more like written speech,
Yes,
actual speech, things written in speech patterns, things using everyday vocabulary. Those things quite often work really well as audiobooks.
dialogue
Because,
heavy Roddy Doyle books are brilliant audiobooks. Yeah,
or what was that? The zombie one, World War Z,
World War Z.
which was because it was set up as interviews. And
Yeah,
so it is an absolutely pitch perfect audiobook
yeah,
because it is designed to be listened to.
yeah.
Things written in iambic pentameter or that use a lot of that
Rhythm.
structure
Yeah.
to writing,
Mhm.
paying very much attention to that rhythm. They actually work really, really well as audiobooks. Things that have structural repetition built into them. They can work very, very well because what happens is, something is about to occur. So there are a little couple of subtle hints that this thing is about to occur. Then the thing occurs, and you go through the thing, and there are enough break points during whatever event it is to take in what has just happened. Then after that event, there'd be the sort of the repercussions, and then someone will give little recaps. There'd be little hints dropped about what just happened to make sure that you understood it. Sorry, excuse me. So that structural repetition, again, is one of those things that makes a book a lot more accessible because it's reminding the reader or the listener of what happened so that you can constantly keep up and bear in mind the important key points. And again, that's another style of narrative that both works as an audiobook, but also if you're not used to trying to hold a lot of the stuff in your head at once.
Yeah.
Books that rely very heavily or use higher levels of diction, so more complicated vocabulary. What you personally, as a reader, perceive as a higher level of diction is personal to you.
Yeah.
That, I think, is where a lot of people see accessibility issues.
Mhm.
Because they go, well, this could have been more accessible if it was written in a different style. And you go, yes, but would it still be the same? Do you really want this changed out of the language that it is in to make it more bland or simplified? Would it still evoke the same emotions? And if it doesn't, then you go, that's a stylistic choice made by the author. Um, Stuff that is written in a lyrical style, the more familiar you are with poetry, the easier and more accessible a lyrical style is. If you're unfamiliar with poetry, it could be potentially more difficult and less accessible because
Yeah.
you're not used to decoding that style of writing. So, accessibility is a shifting line in the sand that quite often when we talk about it, we're making assumptions that we know where the base norm is. And that is exactly where the base norm should be. And then we're judging something based on our understanding of it. So we go, this is more difficult or more complex or using a style that is not part of the base norm. And this is where the base norm is. And you go, okay, well, give me examples of your books that fit on that norm. So you give those examples. And then you go and ask another, and they go, oh, no, but that book's really complex. That's less accessible. That book's accessible. And quite often it's levels of literacy. That's a big one. Levels of vocabulary, exposure to different techniques, and familiarity with these different things.
Yeah.
But, and again, in a commercial market, you have to take the reader where they are. And the weird thing about literature is, until basically the invention of audiobooks, literature had a built-in gatekeeping aspect, which was you needed a certain level of education in order to access the book. TV, like a kid can watch any TV program, whether they should or should not. Like I watched the film Predator when I was very young. Probably shouldn't have, but there's no age gate on
Yeah.
watching something. But even then, like some of the terms used in the film, a gorilla. Why would those apes be wandering around in this jungle, be attacking those nice soldiers? Different type of gorilla AP, but young AP did not know that, was unfamiliar with that word. Oh, well, they could have used a different word then and made it more accessible. It was an over 18 film. They shouldn't have been making it more accessible.
Yeah.
But accessibility, allowing access, you go, at the minute, we have so much accessibility of text because we have audiobooks. Even if you can't get an audiobook, you can get an ebook. If you can't get the ebook, there are physical books. We have libraries, lending libraries. There are so many different ways to get text that literature has become more accessible now than at any other point in human history. And even if you have an e-text and you can't read, there are screen readers that will create basically your own narration. They will turn it into an audiobook for you.
Yeah.
That the level of, I think people are confusing accessibility as, can we access this literature? Yes, we have access to it. We have more access now than ever. It is amazing. And oh well, this is written at a level I don't understand. You, okay,
Hmm.
but in a year's time, you will be at that level because that's what we all do with literacy. Like that's what
Yeah.
we work at. That's what we try to improve. There is no end point where you go, I am now literate.
Hmm.
It is a constant journey and evolution and learning process. And oh well, this book could have been more accessible. Yeah, or it could have been less accessible. Like it could have been more obscure. Um, and some of it will be content dependent, some will be word and vocabulary dependent. Like if a book is really involved in detailing and it requires you to have knowledge of the Knights Templar, you go, well, this was inaccessible. It never explained the Knights Templar to me. Yeah, because it started with the assumption that you knew a lot about the Knights Templar.
Hmm.
Well, they should have put in this section explaining it. Well, that's the book.
Hmm.
And it's not the book's fault. The book was written for an audience. And maybe we are not part of that audience yet,
Yeah.
but there's nothing stopping us becoming part of that audience. There,
Sometimes I actually think that Malazan would be a very cool first experience with fantasy. Um, because you're not bringing that extra baggage with you if you've read 1,000 Dritz books or whatever, the sort of stereotypical hero's journey books, that you're not bringing that notion with you, those expectations with you. Um, and speaking of expectations, actually, I did want to mention um the actual books for a second. So with Gardens of the Moon and with Deadhouse Gates, two characters in particular that I enjoyed how Stephen Erickson played with the expectations of those characters, and I want to get your opinions, what you think of these characters. Um, but in book one, ah, what's his name? Not Croker. Croker is from Black Company. Crocus.
Crocus.
Crocus. Um, I read Black Company as well, so I always get it. Oh, Croker and Crocus. Anyway, Crocus in book one in Gardens of the Moon, and Kalam in book two are two characters that I very much enjoyed seeing how he played with our perceptions of these characters, bringing that baggage of fantasy with you. If you're coming to these books just like no experience with fantasy, never watched Lord of the Rings, never read any, never played any video games, you may not see that he's playing with, okay, here's the young kid, here's Frodo Baggins or whatever in Crocus, who's given a coin, a magic thing, and he's lusting after the young girl like an Egypt. And then with Kalam in book two, where he's on a quest to assassinate Lasine, and at the end he sort of realizes maybe this isn't the quest that I really need to be on. But also, she's not actually there, beside the point. But that I enjoyed how he played with those things in very subtle ways that I only sort of realized towards the end of each book. Anyway.
Yeah, well, so before we talk about those, think about
Mhm.
Gano's parent, and you
Mhm.
go, everyone go, oh well, he's going to be the hero of this story.
Yeah.
Like he's the young boy we see at the start. He's the young noble who's serving in the army. He is now promoted to captain, and then of course he immediately gets knifed.
Yeah.
Uh, you go, oh, okay, well that's a bit different. Now he gets brought back to life, and there are consequences and costs to all of these things, and there are machinations going on, and you see how he's tied to the other things. But one of the interesting things about um, Ganos, he has a sword called, and he has named his sword Chance. He has named his sword Chance. What sort of person? They've gone out, they've become a soldier, and they go, I know I've bought this very fancy because he's a noble, he had money. He
Yeah.
buys a really fancy sword, and he legendary name. The other thing that we know about his sword, he's never used it.
Mm-hmm.
And those are two minor pieces of information that are, in the rest of the stuff that we hear about Gano's parent. But they are very telling and important pieces of information because he is not the young hero. If he was the young hero, why has he never used his sword?
Mm-hmm.
We're already being told early on that he is not what you think he is. And if we keep projecting onto him the fact that, well, he's going to be the hero of this story, he's the stereotypical fantasy hero, blah, 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 blah. That's on us for not picking up on the thing. And then when we see him get knifed when he arrives in, you're like, what? And then, oh, well, he's now been resurrected. Well, he is going to be the chosen one. And you're like, what so far is leading you down this line? And it's us projecting onto the text our understanding of how characters like this have been used in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And we've completely ignored all of the information that we have been given that doesn't fit with that.
Yeah.
We're not taking meaning from the text. We're projecting meaning onto the text and ignoring the information that doesn't confirm our bias. With Crocus is your typical callow youth. Like, how many books, no matter what genre you're in, do you have the young character who doesn't know anything about this thing that has the more experienced friends who are going to explain the world to him? And, we have an expectation maybe of what his journey is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he's a young street rat who's found a magical item and basically has fallen in love with a princess. He's a diamond in the rough, some might say. But that's not what happens. Because if you think about it, if Aladdin, breaks in to see Jasmine late at night in her bedroom, Disney isn't going to go, yeah, so Jasmine immediately went, who's this weirdo who's broken into my room in the middle of the night? I feel violated. It's, oh, look at that handsome guy.
Yeah.
We expect that. And so when we're confronted with Chalice's perfectly normal, perfectly natural feeling of being violated,
Mm-hmm.
we go, what? But that's not how this story is to work out.
Mm-hmm.
And even Crocus, like, because he's a dumb teenager, is going like, he hasn't thought about it either because he's still
What did I
thinking
do? Yeah.
of
Yeah.
all of those romance stories where, oh, if you see the pretty girl and you break into her room at night, she's going to be happy to see you. You're like, no, Crocus, that's not how real life works.
Yeah.
And so we get this commentary almost on the artifice of that particular type of storyline in fantasy. So why does it feel, when we see this happen here, why is it not satisfying? It's because we actually were expecting it. We wanted to see that. That's the path that we are used to taking.
Mm-hmm.
Even Kalam, when you think of an assassin, fantasy has a really weird relationship with assassins. Assassins typically don't look like assassins. Otherwise, they are soon ex-assassins.
Yep.
Assassins don't look like assassins. Otherwise, they are really bad at their job. And, in a lot of D&D, in a lot of the role-playing games, assassins were acrobatic, dexterity, and all of this. Kalam is described as a hulking bear of a man. Like, he's a huge guy who is an assassin in the sense that, yeah, he's been paid to kill people. And so, oh, we've been set up. Lucine is the bad guy. Lucine is this evil person. Oh, Kalam is going to be the hero, setting aside the fact that he's an assassin by trade. That, like, he's not a nice guy. He's the hero. We put him in that mold. Lucine, oh, she's bad. She's evil because, of these other things that happen. So she must be evil. And then we get the complexity of, no, but that's not how empire functions. It's not some mad, maniacal, twisted, mustache twirling villain going, oh, I'm going to be evil for evil's sake. It's the cold nature of the calculating decisions of empire. No, I'm writing you off. All those people, that's a decision I made. It's going to cost too much to save them. They're all going to that. And again, people overlook it. They overlook how critical Erikson is of empire throughout all of these books. Because they go, oh, but the bridge burners are so nice. You mean those soldiers who were planting explosives in civilian concourses? Like those guys.
Yeah.
Those are your good guys. The ones who, when it was found out that they had killed their new captain, it was like, yeah, but that happens.
Yeah.
Those cold-blooded murderers. The ones who made the deal with the Moranth that the Moranth could have an hour of blood to wander around Peel and murder as many men, women, and children as they wanted to in that hour. Those good guys. Those are the good guys you're talking about. Oh, but like the actual characters are good, and therefore this is pro-empire. What?
And he never he like I don't think he ever gives you any indication either way. He's just presenting you with these things. And it's what I really appreciate as well. Like, and it also I think lends itself to the fact that you should take your time with these books. Read a chapter or two, sit down, ponder, think about it. But this, yeah, the need for consumption, you might breeze past all of this stuff and go, oh, well, the bridge burners are the good guys. They're like, the Bad Batch from Star Wars, which I felt like they were the Bad Batch from Star Wars when I was first reading it. But
And
yeah,
then matters get complicated. Like,
yeah,
but even if you look at the prologue, in the prologue, young Gano's parent is watching the riot in the mouse quarter
hmm
and smells a slaughterhouse burning. And he is not corrected by Whiskey Jack going, no, that's not a slaughterhouse that's on fire. Those are people. But you're told this was basically under Lassine's order. It was Tattersail was down there. And this is the Malazan army crushing Malazan citizens. That is unambiguously not pro empire.
yeah,
The next time we see the empire, there's a little girl standing at the side of the road with a wax witch who is apparently being mean to her. So a Malazan soldier walks past and punches the wax witch in the face, killing her. So not only do you have a soldier of the empire killing an old lady, but no one cares. That level of brutality is not, oh, well, that's strange. Why did you act that way? It's like, no, that's how brutal they are.
it's
That's how little
commonplace.
power these citizens have. And again, you go, how is this a pro Malazan stance? It's not. This is reflective of the world that we are in.
hmm
And oh, but he said the Malazans were better than those people. You're like, yeah, the least bad option does not make the least bad option good. It just makes it the least bad compared to the really terrible one.
Yeah,
And we project so much onto this because we have quite often an expectation that there are good guys and there are bad guys, that there's this simplistic moral binary. For all of the interesting stuff that Tolkien does, there is the clear side of good and a clear side of evil.
hmm
Like it's clearly established. We know these are the good guys, those are the bad guys. There are clean lines. And of course, there's some nuance in between.
yeah.
But for the vast majority of it, you can make a clear distinction. The Malazan world isn't that. It's much messier.
I
It's
think a
much.
sorry, I think a pivotal scene as well for me, and I'm gonna bring up Dune as well. Is the banquet scene or the dinner scene, and it did exactly the same for me as Herbert's banquet scene in Dune did for that book, which is, oh shit, this is a lot more complex than what is being presented in the first couple of chapters. And like with Lorne, who is to me being set up as this sort of villainous, untrustworthy person, but we're not following her. We're following Tattersail, and I kind of grow to like Tattersail. And then we sit in the banquet, and you're head hopping in the way that Herbert sort of does in Dune, and you get revelations of people around the table and their motivations, and uh, everything just sort of flips a little bit. And you're like, okay, it's not so simple. It's a bit more. And I think that scene itself, that chapter is so pivotal to the book and probably pivotal to the series, I'm sure. In the same way that the banquet scene in Dune is. And anyway, I just really appreciate that. And also, as an aside, because I just thought of it, it pisses me off that they did not use that scene in the Dune movies because it's the best scene and it's the pivotal scene. Anyway, that's a
And
side.
the dinner sequence, which is I think is chapter 9 in Gardens of the Moon, is one of my favorite sequences in Gardens of the Moon,
Hmm.
precisely because in that you get Lorne, who you think is a not particularly nice person, and
Hmm.
then you realize that she's a victim, and then you see Tattersail, who we like, and you realize that she's done some pretty horrible things.
Yeah.
And then we see Tattersail being the good person and going, "Oh well, I'll offer to fight," and it's, "Oh well, doesn't she know that Lorne has an Atadral sword and that's gonna?" And it's, no, she does know. She knows that she's going to die, but it'll help heal Lorne.
Hmm.
And then basically the Empire stepping in, the voice of the Empire being uttered in that sequence, which is, no, we need everyone here. We've all done bad things in the past. Dujek steps in and says, none of our hands are clean.
Yeah.
And in that moment, you see the spark of Lorne as a person die,
Yeah.
and her personality be crushed by her role, by the needs and necessity of empire. And again, I would say why people think the Malazan Empire are the good guys when we constantly are being shown these things that show that the empire uses people up, that empire and the colonial powers in this are not good. And
To
I've
the
tried to
point.
keep the examples to the bits that you've read because there are some
Yeah.
fantastic examples later on.
Oh, cool. But like to the point as well, to where yeah, Lauren just sort of wastes away until she dies in a what felt like, oh well, this sort of powerful person in the empire is just gone now, just dead. Like not like a fart in the wind, but like
No, but knifed in an alley, basically.
yeah, yeah, just gone.
But
Insignificant.
that's what happened to Ganos at the start.
Yep.
So there's nice symmetry. But also B, again, it goes against our expectation about what a story should do, because
Yeah.
no, it should have been a duel to the death between Ganos and Lorne,
Yeah.
or it should have been like, why should it have been? What a lot of these things show us is the type of book and series that this is, that this is not about doing the stereotypical thing. It's people can die and they aren't going to necessarily get the great and glorious dramatic death that their story or their character deserves.
Hmm.
That this is no, like, someone was doing the thing and they were really important and then they died.
Yeah.
Like when you read some of the stories about soldiers in World War II, and this great courageous soldier who had done all these things, survived all of these battles, and then one day is sitting by the side of the road and someone drops a rifle and it goes off and hits him in the head and he dies. He didn't get to die in a great and glorious battle. He died in an ignominious way. Or someone falling off their horse. Was it William the Conqueror fell off his horse, basically fractured his coccyx, and that's what killed him. He didn't die in battle.
Mm.
People don't always get the dramatic or melodramatic end.
Yeah.
And sometimes we look at that and we feel, but I wanted the artificial drama. And then we realize, did we just ask for artificial drama when usually we're asking for realism?
Hmm.
And it's this tension in these different forces that we have when we read. And that if Erickson is deliberately subverting that, people go, oh well, that's just cheap. Why?
Yeah.
It clearly caught you out
Yeah.
because you weren't expecting it. And it then quite often doesn't occur to us to go, well, why was I expecting it? Why would that have been more natural? Oh, but that's how stories work. right, what sort of stories? And it takes us down this whole rabbit hole of knowing ourselves, knowing our reading, knowing our prejudices and our biases and our expectations, and confusing a preference for what a book should be doing.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why I really like the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because in so many, with my studies, I was actively looking at all of these patterns. I was looking at how they were being created. I was looking at where they were coming from. And to find a book that constantly kept throwing it back in my face was such a novel experience.
Yeah. And
And
sorry, go on. No, go
I
on.
was about to say, but as the genre moves on, it becomes less novel because more people do it, or they are deconstructing different elements, and then that
Yeah.
becomes popular. But as these were coming, once I had gotten them and I started reading them as they were coming out,
Mhm.
this was fascinating, and I really appreciate that. Looking back on it now, like 20 years later, and going, well, is it as new now? No, of course it's not as new now. The genre's had 20 years to move on.
Yeah.
It'll read slightly differently now.
Hmm.
But yeah, but those are just my thoughts on that.
The it's that sort of winking at the reader that I'm enjoying a lot. I feel like Erickson is winking at me a lot, and like I'm a bit of a cheeky fucker, so I enjoy that. And it's that also sense of humor and sense of fun. And there's a playfulness to it that I wasn't expecting because whatever impression I had about the books going in, oh, it was sort of a heady, sort of philosophical type of deal. Um, heavy thematic kind of whatever. I expected to read just that. But these books are really fun. And I'm in Memories of Ice. Memories of Ice has my favorite scene so far in all three books. Uh, and of course, it involves my favorite character, Krupp, which I understand is a controversial figure among the Malazan fandom. But I appreciate I appreciate a funny man who is not taken seriously because he presents himself as a bit of a silly whatever. But he's like he's underappreciated, I think. Anyway, my favorite scene so far is when they're all together doing the big sort of the council, and is it the lads steal the table to go off and play whatever. And then it turns out it's like a magic Yu-Gi-Oh card or whatever. Uh, and the deck, it's the deck of dragons, and Paran, it also is the table. Explaining this series at face value is wild. But that's what I really love. It's like all of this craziness is in there. It's like a D&D campaign. You can feel that they were sitting around a table eating snacks, coming up with this stuff, and Krupp hanging on to the table, flying away with the magic card, and then dropping down at the end of the chapter. It's just like, so, is anyone hungry? It's fantastic. And then the little hints of Paran going to the guys and seeing that they're carrying a big table, and they're like, okay. And then later he's like, that's the table that they stole. I knew that. Just these little bits of playfulness were unexpected to me, honestly, going into the books, but I love them.
There's a really early, very brief scene that is one of my favorites, which is when Trots is sitting at the top of the peak as a lookout. And I can't remember which soldier it is walking up behind him, but Trots has very specifically tried to assume a pose to look like the noble savage because he can hear the person coming up. So it's the
Yeah,
and and it's so clear that this is a deliberate pose that he has put on, and the other guy's, oh,
yeah,
can you just go and do the thing?
yeah,
And you get a real sense then that this is one of the tricks that makes us think that these functions, these ciphers, these things on the page are real people because we know those are the kinds of things that we would pull with our friends.
course.
that uh, they seem like people we have met in real life who would do the thing to get that reaction,
Yeah.
that we can imagine them being real. And also, like, if you've been stuck for, I don't know if you've ever been on a long camping trip or ever been on anything where you've been stuck with the same people for weeks on end,
Yep.
and you get a bit stir crazy, and so much of that we can see in how a lot of these characters react, and the hijinks that the soldiers get up to that you were just talking about the table, and you go, that just reminds me of like dumb stuff that undergraduates have done at university, like the famous, I was it in MIT, where the students went down, they disassembled their professor's car, broke into his office, and reassembled his car inside his office.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
because that's what they do. Like it was a prank and it was really silly. But that's the kind of stuff that it feels so outlandish. And yet you go, yeah, but I can kind of imagine that.
Yeah. Yeah. My leaving cert year, for anybody who doesn't know, leaving cert is the final state exam in Ireland before you leave school. Our leaving cert year was getting up to exams. We were all supposed to be studying and doing these after school, whatever. Our weekly trick, was to shove all the desks and chairs into one of the four classrooms, and everybody from all four classrooms would then shove into another one that didn't have any of the tables and chairs and sit on the floor and just wait for the teachers to show up in the morning. It was wonderful. Anyway, that kind of stuff I appreciate because I'm the kind of scallywag that would do that kind of stuff. um, but one thing I wanted to mention as well quickly, before we go, we're going for, geez, 2.5 hours. The whole journey versus destination thing that um I think for people who maybe want to read the books, I know this is like at the tail end of a 2.5 hour conversation where we said we'd be talking about spoilers. But if you have not read the books, um, the appreciating the journey over the destination, which is a bit of a cliche, but I find even with, with Kalam, with Mappo and Akarium, um, that kind of change in your perception of what it is the point of what you're reading. Um, I think can be applied to the individual books themselves just because you're hopping around the continents as well. And people finding this frustration with, oh, I've just gotten used to these characters and now we're going to meet another set of characters. If you treat it like a tapestry of, okay, here's a set of characters, we'll meet them again. And I get another set of characters and another set of characters. And then eventually that convergence, I feel, is going to happen because he's done that in the two books so far for me, where we have all these disparate things and then it all comes to a convergence. Um, I feel like the whole series is a bit like that. So that's just my thoughts on that.
The way that I tried to explain this was, if you were writing a story about World War II and you wanted to tell a 10-book series about what World War II was, book one, you might start with something happening in Germany and that area. Book
Yeah.
two, you might move to North Africa or Italy. Book three, you might start bringing in the UK or America.
Mm-hmm.
Book four, you start moving around to where the thing is. But once you've put all of the books together, you suddenly have this complete picture of World War II.
Yeah.
But you don't have the same people necessarily in book one that are going to be in book two and book three in a nice chronological sequence.
Yeah.
If your picture is of a bigger thing, then, and this is the big ask that I think Erickson makes. Erickson is asking the reader to trust him that what he is showing in each of these individual novels is necessary for understanding the entire mosaic or tapestry or picture that he is trying to convey.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a linear chronological sequence following a small group of characters. That's not what it is, but it is never promised to be that.
Yeah.
Um, and so thinking about it in terms of the Eastern campaign, the Western campaign, the Pacific campaign, the North African campaign of World War II as these different things that you're going to be shown. And there might be references to things that have happened in the other books, or characters might bleed over between them. But each is a novel in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it fits together by, once you get to click them all into place, you go, ah, this is the story that is being told. But because of that, because it's not the expected chronological sequencing, because it's not following Gano's parent and his magic sword as he goes on a quest to rid the world of Sauron. And these are the companions he gathered along the way. Because it's not that,
Mm.
people go, but why isn't it that thing? It would have been better if it was that thing. No, it would have been the Wheel of Time if it was that thing.
Yeah.
It would have been the Sword of Truth if it had been that thing. Like, there are those series. It doesn't pretend to be that thing. It's not
Yeah.
trying to be that thing. And so to say that, well, it fails because it isn't that thing, that's like saying that plane fails at being a truck. Like, but it's a plane. I know, but a truck would have been better in this circumstance. But it's not trying to be a truck.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that people can't go, but I wanted a truck. You're like, yeah, that's fine. I would have preferred a truck. Awesome. I would have enjoyed it more if it was a truck. Brilliant. It's still not a problem with the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, I think you're right that each book is an individual narrative that clips together with these other things. And from that, once you have finished, you get to stand back and look at the revealed pattern.
Mm.
And that can change your understanding and appreciation of a bunch of the different things that happen, because you suddenly see it. It's getting that new lens that allows you to see things in a different light, and you go, oh.
Yeah.
And so if you choose at that point, like at that point, the revelations happened. You understand what has happened. Like there's no, you don't need to reread. But now when you reread, it's like rereading an Agatha Christie novel once you know who the murderer is. And you're like, when I reread this, I'm going to be looking for those things. And suddenly character behavior that you didn't like before, you're like, but I know why they're acting that way. And oh, that ties into it. It's a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
But that experience is not necessary for the understanding of the series. You get that after finishing it once.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like looking at a large wall-sized painting in an art gallery where you're looking at, you can focus in on little details and what's going on, and then you step back and you look at what's going on around that, and then eventually you see, and you can zero in or you can zoom out, and by the end of it, it will be one entire wonderful experience, hopefully for me, within the next 5 to 6 years.
Yeah. And the one thing I would say is, like, read at your own pace.
Yeah.
Read as you are going to do the things that you want to read. The books aren't going anywhere. They have been published. You can always come back to them whenever. And people say that you need to use, like, I think there's an online guide. I've never actually looked through it, but they go, oh, here's this guide to show you this. There's this wiki, and there's the different read-alongs. Those can be fun, but
Mhm.
they're not necessary. None
Yeah.
of it is necessary. It isn't homework. It isn't that difficult.
Yeah.
But for people not used to the style of storytelling, or maybe Erickson doesn't do it as well as you would want him to, those things can be useful.
Mhm.
And that's fine. But when people say you must look at these things and insist on it, that's where I feel a bit uncomfortable, because like none of these things existed when I read it the first time. And I have only read the books twice. Like
Yeah.
I there are people out there, Malazan fans out there, who have read the books far more than I have. And their recall of very specific lines is absolutely stunning.
Mhm.
I've read the books twice in 20 years. That's and my level of understanding of this text is based on reading these books twice in 20 years. Like it's not and not and a thing where I've had to spend hours upon hours pondering over every book. You go, no, I read them. This is what
Yeah.
I picked up. Um,
And
so people who say,
here's me calling you the Grand Maester of Malazan at the start of this video.
and that's why I said, like, I'm deeply embarrassed because there are a bunch of Malazan fans out there who are brilliant. They know the books inside out. They have fantastic essays and insights into it. So people like Niflrog and Ruth and Bad and is it Lolly on the Malazan subreddit. Like there are people out there who really know this whole series inside out, and I am stunned by their level of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But quite often, if you can see the underlying patterns, which is part of what I was trained in, quite often you go, yeah, but of course it's that thing because of this, and this, because it's all connected to that, because you understand how it was done.
Yeah.
And you have paid attention to the man behind the curtain. You know how the trick was pulled off, and therefore you don't need to work it out from the little things that the trick is showing because you know the mechanism behind it. And that's
Yeah.
it's kind of a cheat code.
Yeah. Anyway, shall we wrap this up, AP? It's been a good long time. I'm sure you need to have your dinner. I don't know what time it is over there, but I assume it's probably close to dinner time. And we're very close to my bedtime as well. But anyway, what were you going to say?
Well, I want to thank you so much for inviting me on. This was very kind of you to do so. I've had so much fun chatting about this. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and commenting on one of the videos that I did as well. And I think I tagged you or something. But anyway, um, but yeah, it's you and other booktubers are, I guess, a big pillar of this little niche community that we have here. Um, and also breaking down the barriers of getting into some of these books for people who may find them daunting. You're a big figure in that as well. And I appreciate you coming on and chatting for a big chunk of your day. And everybody who is watching, if you are not subscribed to AP, he is at A Critical Dragon on YouTube. So go subscribe to him. Go watch his videos. Go watch his prologue analyses, which I have done. What I'm doing now with the books is going back and to your playlist. So if I'm making my way through Gardens of the Moon at the moment, then I'm going to go to the Deadhouse Gates split. And it's great. I've unlocked levels of content as I go. So anyway, thanks everybody for watching. We're going to let AP go have his dinner. And I'll see you guys whenever.